The landing gear indicator on Pacific Atlantic Flight 822 had blinked amber for exactly 4 seconds before going dark entirely, and in that darkness, Captain Reginald Voss felt something colder than fear settle into his chest. 312 souls sat behind him in the cabin, unaware that the mechanism meant to bring them safely down to the runway in Denver had failed somewhere over the Rockies, jammed by a hydraulic line that had ruptured without warning. He had flown for 28 years, had handled engine fires and emergency diversions and turbulence that turned strong men's stomachs. But a gear failure at this altitude, with this little fuel remaining, was a different breed of problem entirely, one with no clean checklist answer waiting at the bottom of the page. Before this story goes further, I want you to sit with this for a second. Somewhere on every flight you've ever taken, there's a person in the back of the plane whose job you barely notice, whose name you never bothered to learn, and who might know something about that aircraft that the captain himself doesn't. If that idea unsettles you a little, good, because it should, and it's exactly why this story matters. Drop a comment if you've ever underestimated someone whose quiet expertise turned out to save the day, and subscribe if you want more stories that look past the cockpit to find the real heroes hiding in plain sight. Her name was Carol Whitfield, 54 years old, a flight attendant who had worked this same aircraft type for 19 years, longer than half the pilots currently flying it had even held a license. She had started her career as a young woman who'd washed out of an aviation maintenance program for reasons that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with an industry that, in 1991, simply didn't make room for women in hangars. She'd taken the flight attendant job instead, swallowing the disappointment, but she'd never stopped reading maintenance manuals on her layovers, never stopped quietly absorbing the mechanical guts of every aircraft she flew, the kind of knowledge nobody asked for and nobody valued, until the day it became the only thing standing between Flight 822 and disaster when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom requesting any crew member with mechanical knowledge to come forward immediately. Most of the cabin assumed it was a formality, a box being checked. Carol unbuckled without hesitation, walked the length of that trembling aircraft past 200 faces, trying not to look terrified, and stepped into the cockpit where Voss and his first officers sat, surrounded by checklists that weren't solving anything. She'll listen to them describe the hydraulic failure, the dead indicator, the manual extension procedure that wasn't responding the way it should, and something in her settled into place. The same quiet clarity she'd felt decades earlier hunched over disassembled landing gear assemblies in a training hangar that no longer wanted her. She told them about an access panel behind the aft galley, a maintenance point most crew never thought twice about, one she'd watched mechanics use a dozen times over the years during ground inspections. If the manual release cable had simply jammed rather than snapped, there was a chance, a real but narrow chance, that someone could reach it from inside the aircraft and free it by hand. Voss looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look reserved for either madness or salvation, and then nodded, because at 30,000 feet with no better option on the table, even a narrow chance was a gift he couldn't refuse. What followed was 23 minutes of Carol on her knees in a cramped, vibrating compartment, flashlight clenched in her teeth, working a frozen cable with hands that had gone numb from cold air bleeding through a gap never meant to be touched mid-flight. The first officer relayed her progress to the tower in clipped, urgent updates while passengers sat in a silence so complete it felt like the whole aircraft was holding its breath alongside her. On her final attempt, with blood from a torn knuckle smearing the cable housing, the mechanism gave way with a shudder that traveled through the entire airframe, and 3 green lights bloomed across the cockpit panel like the most beautiful thing Voss had seen in his career. The landing itself was rough but controlled, the kind that earns applause and tears in equal measure, and when the aircraft finally rolled to a stop on the runway, the cabin erupted into a sound that was part relief, part disbelief. But Carol wasn't in her jumpseat to hear it. The same violent vibration that had freed the gear had also wrenched her shoulder from its socket and cracked her ribs against the unforgiving metal of that cramped compartment, injuries she'd silently endured through the final minutes. Because stopping wasn't an option 300 lives could afford, she was carried off on a stretcher to paramedics waiting on the tarmac, smiling faintly through obvious pain as relieved passengers reached out just to touch her hand as she passed. She would recover, though her shoulder never fully returned to what it once was. And she retired 8 months later, not because she wanted to, but because her body had quietly finished giving everything it had left to give. The airline named a training scholarship after her, one specifically meant for women in aviation maintenance, the field that had once turned her away. Carol said only that she hoped some young woman, somewhere, would get the chance she never had, and that this time nobody would have to nearly die for her knowledge to finally matter. If this story moved you, please hit like and tell me in the comments about someone in your life whose quiet expertise saved the day without anyone noticing. Subscribe for more stories like this one, because the real heroes are so often the ones we almost forgot to thank.